I think the question of beginning in philosophy, in the form of, among other things, the beginning or the way of beginning a major book in philosophy, is very interesting and important. And that's why I'm going to be spending maybe a disproportionate amount of time on the beginning of the immanence of truths, and maybe speed up later. Badu seems to agree with this point of view. I'll just show you the table of contents in French, so we can see that we have a whole long introduction and prologue, and we can even think that the first part, Destinies of Finitude of section 1, part of the beginning. So in that case, the beginning of the book goes from page 11 in the French to page 89, where he starts talking about a poetic example, the poetic trial of modern finitude, as can be seen in the poems of René Char. Just to give you an idea, all that, the way that the English translation is cut up seems to be slightly different. So all that I showed you, the introduction, the prologue, and the first section of part 1, all seem to be grouped together, unless they're leaving out something, but that would surprise me, into a separate combined introduction. And then we get the example of René Char. So the introductory material is quite substantial, as is the case with Laruelle in A Biography of Ordinary Man. And then, as I signaled yesterday, in the last chapter, Badiou starts off straight away with the immanence of truths. Truth is absolute, eternal, generic, and asubjective, all the while being determinate. So he starts us off with his concepts, his theses, but as well he starts us off straight away with his own particular philosophical language. So we have to make the leap straight away. Either we're familiar with his work as it has developed over time, or we can, why not? We can begin the book without knowing Badiou's previous work, and in both cases we have to immerse ourselves by incommensurable leap into Badiou's new language. So I think this is the point of Badiou beginning with saying that for over 30 years now, what his philosophical strategy is. Badiou is quite well established and world renowned as a philosopher, so he doesn't need to mention his 30 years of work as some sort of validation, because his authority to speak to us in this way is in question. I think, well, he's beyond that. So I think the recalling of these 30 years, that is to say, 30 years means from the publication of Being an Event, that he's recalling that he has established what we could call a tradition, his own particular personal, in the sense of the philosophical person, his own tradition or sub-tradition, if you don't want to say tradition. So that's part of having a creative research program. So the use of language is to be understood from within inside that new language, that sub-language, or that tradition, or that research program. Otherwise, you're going to have only a vague and fuzzy idea of what the terms mean, and a vague and fuzzy idea of what Badu is saying. He tells us, so grouping all those ideas together, his idea, his central concept is that of concrete universal exceptions, and that's so he's given us the core of his research program, the theoretical core in these few lines. Then the polemical part, so it's the negative heuristic, is against, of course, onto-theological apparatuses, and that's still necessary, but it's no longer the main target. The whole idea of Nietzsche, God is dead, the crisis of foundations, and so on, is that onto-theology, with its identification of the one and the absolute in the form of a dogmatic system or idea or image, that's finished. It may continue, but it no longer, in our societies, it no longer has any living energy to it. This is the result of what Badu calls a process of de-absolutisation or dis-absolutisation. And then he warns us, because he wants to get to what is the principal enemy today, that this dis-absolutisation or de-absolutisation, we could also call it deterritorialisation, that has gone perhaps too far, or is in danger of going too far, because he says we cannot accept that we must de-absolutise all the forms of the multiple. We free the multiples from this onto-theological one, and we may simply just switch over to the opposite and de-absolutise everything, and then we will be stuck in relativism. And the problem with relativism on a social level is that we can be totally manipulated. We can be totally submerged in ideology with no Archimedean point of leverage to resist, and to not just resist, but to do other things, to think other things, to create other things. So we de-absolutise, that's good, but we can't just stop there. We need to re-absolutise, which is what Badu has done over his 30 years, and in fact more, his philosophical research program. And to re-absolutise means we have this idea of the absolute that he's going to give much more substance to, but we have it in a new and different way outside the onto-theological enclosure. So the twin dangers there are an epistemological de-absolutization in terms of relativism, and a social political de-absolutization in the form of what he called democratism. And I combine these two faces of what is basically the same adversary, relativism and democratism. I propose the term democratic relativism to describe the whole apparatus. So Badiou goes on. Now I'm at the bottom of the first page of the Immanence of Truths. Badiou goes on to say that this raises the question of orientation. Because we've de-absolutized and we're in the relativist ocean, or we're stuck on the relativist continent. We need both metaphors, I think. But anyhow, we're in a mess. We're in a relativist, democratist mess, and we have no orientation. The old ontotheological orientation is no longer available for most of us, and the new, so that's the transcendental, that's the transcendent orientation, and the new orientation, the relativist orientation, is in fact a permanent disorientation. So what Badiou is proposing is what he calls a generic orientation of thought, for which under certain conditions multiplicities exist which can have a universal value. And that's the whole stake of this book, to give us this new real orientation, the generic orientation, and what can be deduced from it as a way of liberating us from the democratist relativist orientation. So Badiou's key idea on characterizing this adversary, which is at the same time philosophical and ideological, social, is to say that the key concept underlying it and grounding the democratic relativism, or what he calls democratic materialism, is finitude. So, to quote, the ontological thesis subjacent to democratic materialism is finitude. There are only bodies and languages. The absolute and universality are dangerous concepts. So once again, he's taking up the beginning of logics of worlds, and in a quite concise and condensed way, he's saying the enemy is relativism and democratism, and however infinite all the changes seem to be, in fact, this enemy can be identified with the hegemony of finitude. He goes on to praise Quentin Meillassoux for his absolute innovative procedure, and he considers that Meillassoux has in the title of his book, After Finitude, discerned the enemy that we must undo and defeat. And he claims that Meillassoux, by his new conceptual means, has created a new conceptual possibility for saving transcendence, so a redefined transcendence, from the twin enemies of the onto theology and of democratic materialism. So that's coming out quite in praise of Meillassoux, situating Meillassoux' work within a research program that is at least, despite the option of saving transcendence, but in a new way, is at least compatible or compossible with Badiou's position. In Badiou's eyes, it's compossible. I think this is an interesting putting into perspective of Meillassoux' work, and I must confess that I had a negative reaction to Meillassoux' work at the beginning, because I became aware of it from the discussion in English of Meillassoux by the object-oriented ontology movement. And because the object-oriented ontology is for me just comic book philosophy in a bad sense of comic book, that gave me a bad door of entry into Meillassoux' work, and I regret that now, because seeing Meillassoux not totally through Badiou's eyes, but in seeing Meillassoux in that context, gives a far better understanding of what Meillassoux was doing and of the positive value of that sort of effort. So my advice is to you, is don't look at anything through object-oriented ontology spectacles. Don't, if you've read it, try and forget it, and think that everything it says about anyone else is just as rubbishy as its own basic ontological presuppositions. Don't get fooled by the recent attempt by Zizekians to gain some sort of wider audience by entering into dialogue with object-oriented ontology. There's nothing there to enter into dialogue with. So let's stick with serious thinkers like Badiou, Deleuze, Laruelle, and there are, of course, others in the list, but this is why the beginning is important. My beginning with Meillassoux was contaminated by this spontaneous ideology of capitalism formalized into object-oriented ontology, and that was a bad beginning. Fortunately, we can always make an incommensurable leap. As one of the theses of Badiou's book, we can always make an incommensurable leap and see things from a different perspective. So Badiou goes on to say that the ideology of finitude is based on a triple hypostasis of the finite. So it's putting the finite on a pedestal and giving it that sort of reified absolute value. First, the finite is what there is, what exists. So he hasn't said why that's wrong for the moment, but that's as Badiou is isolating out the presuppositions of democratic relativism. That's for him the core, that it gives supreme value to finitude and gives the ultimate ontological position to finitude. And it's always this double thing that we could call ethics and ontology that are linked together. Finitude imposes itself on us because it convinces us or reinforces our conviction from our ideological position that we have trouble resisting. It convinces us that there is only finitude and that finitude is the supreme value. So Badiou is quick to diagnose that this idea of finitude belongs to the so-called reality principle, and he identifies the reality principle under capitalism with the principle of obedience. We must submit ourselves to the realist constraints of finitude. So it's obedience and it's renunciation. It's finitude in Badiou's analysis means ultimately being resigned to the status quo. Even if we imagine that there's infinite possibilities, that we could do lots of things, it's all within the horizon of the status quo. So that's what he calls the principle of objectivity of the finite. Secondly, so second hypostasis, the finite determines that which can be, that which can arrive, or which can happen, or can come to be. So first, it's just there, and you've got to accept it. Finitude is just the way things are. Secondly, finitude is deployed to determine what projects, what goals, what future possibilities we can have. It's the principle of the restriction of possibles. It's the ordinary critique of utopias and of what it brands as ideologies, because the thought of finitude brands other thoughts based on other principles, for example, infinitude, as ideological, other thoughts that think we can change the way we think and act and organize society, are quickly diagnosed as denying finitude, and so as impossible illusions. So the paradigm of these supposedly illusory projects, the paradigm has been, or was in the last century, the communist adventure. Thirdly, so third hypostasis, finitude prescribes what must be under the ontological form of our duty, which is always, finally, to respect what exists. That is to say, capitalism and nature. Nature as we define or see nature under capitalism. And that way, because capitalism interests and capitalism influences how we see nature, we get a vicious circle going where by this constitution of an image of nature, which is then used as a principle of legitimation for the capitalist way of doing things, we have the illusion. This time it's Badu talking about what is an illusion, that capitalism is fundamentally natural. And he calls that the principle of the authority of the finite. So this is the full-blown passage from is to ought, from descriptive to normative. The thought of the finite starts as an ontological description. That's just the way things are. It forbids, it prohibits any other type of thought, and it prescribes, it gives us a positive prescription to respect the order of things, to respect the natural order, which is by definition capitalist, which is by definition the way things are. And so it makes us incapable of imagining or of taking seriously an alternative way of thinking or doing. So that's the principle of finite authority. We've got the principle of obedience, first hypostasis, the principle of the restriction of possibles, that's the second hypostasis, and thirdly, the principle of the authority of the finite. So Badiou considers the postmodern objections against finitude, because they exist, and he says if you look at them closely, they concern mainly the third hypostasis, the authority of the finite. So that means that among those who are in the consensus of democratic materialism, that I call democratic relativism as well, there are quite a lot of people who sort of accept the idea that we're in the postmodern condition, and that means we're in a relativist situation, ontologically and I suppose epistemologically, but we can have and we need an ethical authority which is not legitimated by these ontological and epistemological principles, and that's thought to be a good thing, the detachment of legitimation. So it's clear we're talking about Lyotard's the postmodern condition and Lyotard's later evolution, and contrasting it with other ways of thinking about the postmodern. So for Lyotard, the grand narrative combines everything into one perspective. We have ethics, epistemology, ontology, politics, all lined up within the grand narrative. So people think that Lyotard is totally against grand narratives, and that led Meillassoux often now. He died last year. Recently, over the last 20 or 30 years, to constantly begin his books with the idea of the grand narrative of science, to show us the grand narratives are possible. But in fact, Lyotard would agree with that. He was not against grand narratives in general. That would be silly. He was against the grand narrative of legitimation. And that's the grand narrative that combines is and ought and knowing as well, within the same apparatus. So you've got the theological apparatus, which is one form of grand narrative of legitimation, but the postmodern relativist ethical apparatus is unacceptable as such. It needs to be dismantled, and for Lyotard, that way things will be okay. So in order to struggle against that sort of grand narrative, we need a sort of infinite hypothesis. Badu continues, this is what led the subtle Lyotard. So Badiou and Lyotard had a lot of respect for each other, even though they had radically different theoretical options. Anyhow, this is what led the subtle Lyotard to replace the naive and conceptually finite expression of the rights of man, or of human rights, by the expression with a lot more bite to it of what I, Badiou, willingly take up in my own account, the authority of the infinite. So this is marking a point of agreement with Lyotard, despite not liking the conceptual strategy so much, but they agree on one thing, one very important thing, on the authority of the infinite. Nevertheless, so now we're getting into Badiou's objection. For Lyotard, this authority of the infinite is ultimately founded on a return to the Kant of the third critique. So with the sublime and the law with the capital L, inspired by ancient eschatologies, including or notably those inspired by the Jewish law. So that's a thumbnail sketch of Lyotard's evolution in the 80s. Lyotard published the postmodern condition, and for a short time everything was up for grabs. It was not sort of a disorderly relativism, but it was a pluralism. That's when I met Lyotard in 1980, and I was quite impressed by his book. We discussed, I showed him stuff that I had written on Feyerabend and pluralism, and he was quite enthusiastic. And then I went back to Australia, and I came back to Paris in 1981, and already Lyotard had totally changed. He thought that science shouldn't be put into question, that the status and nature of scientific method was to be left to science as a sort of internal thing. You couldn't have any general perspective to place in relation to other modes of thought. If we take science as a mode of thought, he no longer wanted that sort of endeavor. He accepted, in fact, to retreat from a critical perspective on science and anchored himself in the artistic language game, if you want, or mode of thinking, and began analyzing in a mode of contemporary relevance the notion of the sublime, and began analyzing and propounding an ethical stance under some sort of demystified, de-signified law with a capital L, and those were the twin bases for Lyotard's later work. It became apparent in 1983 with the differend, and Badiou's conclusion is, as is often the case, the renegotiation of finitude ends in reaction. So he's telling us that he was disappointed in Lyotard's evolution because there was a promise of something more complex, but then this idea of the authority of the infinite is confined to ethics, and we get in Lyotard reaction against this infinity that could be perceived, as Badu does, in all the what he calls conditions of thought. So most postmodern thinkers who object to this hegemony of finitude and this implicit or explicit condemnation to relativism, Badiou considers that they reject mainly the third hypostasis. So they're willing to accept the two other hypostases of finitude, the relative finite multiplicities are all there is. So Lyotard accepted that. That the idea of radically changing things in some sort of utopic future is impossible. And Lyotard was always very ambiguous, but he seems to have accepted that as well. He deconstructed Marxism to the point that all he was left with was the different between the workers and capital. And so these thinkers limit themselves just to questioning the ethical principle that gives authority to the finite, and there they come up with some infinite which has authority over this plane of relativist immanence. So there is some sort of transcendent, in some sense of transcendent principle, which places Lyotard in the same, loosely speaking, in the same orientation as Meillassoux. They're all good in what they perceive. They're all good in the rejection of finitude, at least somewhere. And nonetheless, I don't know if he thinks that Meillassoux stops short, but he thinks that Lyotard stops short because he finds the authority of the infinite only in ethics. This might be questionable for Lyotard's ideas on art and the sublime, but as I said, Lyotard seems to have refinitized science in some sense of finitization. So Badiou says there are also some attempts to discuss the second hypostasis. That's the one that concerned the restriction of possibles. So these attempts argue on the basis of an infinite resource of the finite. So that produces a concept of the infinite within finitude itself. And Badu remarks that that's the logic of capitalism itself, but also of other positions, where you have the infinite openness of technological invention, the infinite openness of an amelioration that is always possible for democracy, and of an infinite negotiation with the natural environment. So there's this idea of an infinite resource in scientific and technical invention, an infinite resource in the fact that democracy is an open society, in some sense of open that includes infinite adaptation, and that our relation to nature, even if nature itself is, as we have learned to our dismay, is a finite resource, there can be an infinite renegotiation with nature. So infinite variations and adaptations, and given the idea of technical invention, geoengineering, or even on a grander scale, cosmic engineering is held up as some sort of infinite horizon, despite the empirical finitude of nature. Badu sums all that up. Technical revolutions, democracy in action, and or democracy marching forward, and deep ecology compose a progressist base that is abstractly infinite, and is a base for our irremediable finitudes, an objective overture or openness that is quasi-infinite. So it's an openness to a quasi-infinite objective openness to maximal well-being, that to the maximal well-being that our poor finitude deserves. So we're poor, miserable, finite creatures, but if we accept and obey our finitude, there is a providential gift in store for us. If we really accept just how finite we are, then we'll get the good stuff that we deserve, which is technological innovation all the time, iPhones, maybe everybody going on moon trips, and so on. And we'll get even more and more democracy, and we'll get a new and improved relation to nature. We'll fix it. We'll find a way around the Anthropocene's at the time near irreversible degradation of the planet. And that's what we deserve, because we've accepted our finitude and we've obeyed. In fact, these constructions have no speculative consistence. They propose only a weak stretching out of the finite. So we're not leaping from the finite into an incommensurable, infinite perspective at horizon. We're just sort of eking out the finite. That's the stretching, I suppose, the weak stretching. Sort of like chewing gum, and you stretch it out and it gets sort of thinner and thinner. So it's an eking out, an infinite eking out of finitude. So Badiou's thesis is the opposite of that. The finite, in whatever sense that one takes it, has no being. The finite, which does not exist, exists, if you will, only as a result of operations which engage infinite multiplicities. Or, to be more precise, the finite is, in general, the result of the operatory crossing of two infinites of different type, of different power, to use a mathematical term for the infinites. So we don't know what that means yet. We've leaped into his new language, his new concepts. We've got, in fact, despite the fact that the book has a huge mathematical section, we've got everything being developed in non-mathematical language, except for the use of the infinite, but that has not, up till now, been given any mathematical or precise mathematical connotations. And then suddenly, and I suppose this is the reason for, we could call it the mathematical detour, but maybe it's not a detour, the mathematical heuristics that are developed in the book, to get out of this absolute anchoring of finitude in our perceptions, in our thoughts, and in our plans and our actions. We need a counter thesis, a counter inductive leap, because induction is always going to confirm the thesis of finitude, even on the sort of pseudo-infinite that you may get within science and technology. That's the weak, stretched, finite version of infinity. So we need a counter-inductive, even counterintuitive leap into an incommensurable hypothesis, and to give that substance and density and force and impact, Badu needs the mathematical concepts as well. Maybe later he can de-mathematize, and that will be one of the stakes of my reading of Badu, to de-mathematize overly mathematical readings of Badu's book. There's a lot of mathematics in there, it's important, but Badu himself has showed from this non-mathematical beginning that he himself is quite skillful in de-mathematising, re-mathematising, de-mathematising, re-mathematising as and when needed. And so there's no mathematical reductionism. There's no mathematical essential key to understanding Badiou's philosophy. We need to do the mathematics. We need to master it as much as possible, because that's the positive heuristic for the conceptual creation. But what Badiou is doing is not mathematics, but something else. But still, we need the mathematics. That's our base language for accessing conceptual creation, and in particular, our base language for getting away from this presupposition of finitude. And the key thesis is that the finite is a result. That could be enough to go on, but to give it more substance and more technical density, he refers to the mathematical ideas of set theory. The finite is in general the result of the operatory crossing of two infinites of different power. So for the moment, we don't see the full sense and application of that thought, but he's put it there as part of the incommensurable, counterintuitive, counterinductive leap that we must make, assisted by mathematics. The finite is never anything but a result. This statement, extracted for the first time from all religious contexts, because religious contexts require humility and resignation to our finitude, to our humble finitude before the infinite God. So this new statement that the finite is always only a result will receive its full scope. No, will receive in the full scope of this book the rational justifications that amount to a proof. So that's one of the core findings and the core theses of the book. Finitude has no ontological privilege. Stronger, finitude has no ontological existence in an autonomous way. Where we find finitude, where it exists, it results from the crossing, the encounter, the interference, perhaps possible synonyms, between two infinites of different power.